Okay, let's dive into this. The sources you shared, they really start with something uh, quite arresting, don't they?
They definitely do. This story about a psychic supposedly working with the CIA.
Right. And apparently they're answering all sorts of questions. Seems pretty open.
Yeah, totally fine until that one specific question comes up.
The crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And the source says suddenly the person gets like visibly nervous, shuts right down.
It's that immediate shift, that stark contrast. It just makes you lean in and think, okay, what's really going on here?
Exactly. It makes you wonder about, the sensitivities around these kinds of phenomena.
What might be under the surface?
Precisely. And that's really our launch pad for this deep dive. We're digging into the perspectives from the sources you gave us.
Focusing on how they see psychic abilities, talking to spirits, that kind of thing.
And crucially, where they think the information actually comes from, it's definitely presented through a specific religious viewpoint in these materials.
Yeah, and we looked at a few different kinds of sources, interviews with people identified as, former psychics, former witches.
Uh-huh. And commentary on those stories, plus an analysis of a biblical story, too.
Right. The goal here, just to be clear for you listening, is to pull out the key facts and insights from these specific sources.
We want to help you understand their perspective on it all. We're really sticking just to what the materials say.
No outside info, no taking sides. We're just mapping out what the sources presented.
Okay, so back to that first story, the CIA psychic. It really does set a certain tone.
Yeah, this person seems comfortable talking about, well, pretty unusual abilities and experiences.
Answering things openly. Until that question about the crucifixion. Then, like the source describes, just total shutdown, visibly distressed.
And the interviewer, Sean Ryan, he comments on that, right?
He does. His take in the source is that maybe some people doing this work, even if they mean well, might not actually understand where their information is coming from. They could be, deceived somehow.
That's the angle presented, yeah.
Yeah.
And didn't he mention another case?
He did, yeah. Another psychic, Angela Ford. He said she'd apparently worked with the government, helped find missing kids even.
Okay.
But when he asked her specifically about remote viewing, same kind of reaction, she reportedly clammed up, started rubbing her teeth.
So the source presents it as a possible pattern.
Yeah.
Certain topics, certain terms.
Triggering something negative.
A strong reaction, maybe involuntary.
And Sean Ryan, in the source, connects us to a wider spiritual idea.
Yeah.
He brings up a story about a CEO, Randy.
Oh, yeah, the near-death experience.
Right. Randy apparently felt himself rising, looked down, and saw this spiritual battle happening, like for his soul in another dimension.
Wow.
And Ryan links that from his perspective in the source to a biblical idea about a ruler of this world.
So within the context of these sources, that's kind of setting the stage for this idea that these psychic events might be tied into some underlying spiritual conflict, maybe an adversarial one.
It definitely makes you wonder, looking at these accounts, why certain subjects would provoke that kind of reaction, and what these sources think the real source of the info is.
Well, several sources tackle that directly.
Yeah.
Especially from people who used to be involved themselves.
Like the former witch mentioned in one source.
Exactly. Her story starts when she was young.
Yeah.
Her grandmother died, and she just really wanted to connect with her again. So she went to a medium.
Okay. Makes sense. Grief can make you seek connection.
Totally. And the thing that stood out, that the source really emphasizes, is how incredibly specific the medium was.
Specific how?
Like knowing tiny personal details about the girl's life, about the grandmother,
Yeah.
things a stranger just couldn't possibly know.
Huh. Impressive, but also kind of creepy.
Well, yeah. And the perspective this former witch has now, as the source presents it, is that the medium wasn't actually talking to her grandma.
So, who then?
She believes, and the commentary in the source agrees, that they're talking to what the source calls familiar spirits.
Which they identify as demons.
Yes, within that framework. And her reasoning, laid out in the source, is that these entities, these spirits, they've been around forever.
Okay.
They're smart, they watch people very closely their whole lives, so they gather all this incredibly personal information.
Ah, I see. So they can sound like the deceased relative because they know all their details.
Precisely. It makes the whole thing incredibly convincing to someone who's grieving and wants to believe. Makes the deception work.
And she mentions, didn't she, that back then she had no idea it was considered witchcraft.
Right. Or, as she puts it now, based on her beliefs in the source, illegal access to the spirit realm, necromancy, which she says is explicitly abominable to God.
Even if the medium seemed nice? Or had good intentions?
Yeah, the source points that out. The medium might have genuinely thought they were helping, maybe even believed they were talking to angels or doing God's work,
Hmm.
might have had Bibles or crosses around.
But the interpretation in the source is still that the source of the contact was demonic, regardless of intent.
Correct. Which leads to another account from a former psychic.
Okay. What's her perspective?
She offers what she calls her absolute total proof for the existence and activity of these spirits.
Mm.
She also identifies as demonic.
And what is this proof?
It comes from her own experience, she says in the source. Being able to tell total strangers these incredibly specific, verifiable facts about their dead relatives.
Facts the strangers themselves didn't even know sometimes.
Exactly. Like maybe the specific town their great-grandpa lived in, or his exact job, or some obscure family event. Things the person would have to go and check with older relatives to confirm.
Wow. So not just vague stuff.
No, she stresses that in the source.
Yeah.
She felt like she was just reporting what I'm hearing, what I'm seeing. She insists it was genuinely supernatural information.
Operating above nature, I think was the phrase used.
That's it. And her logic, again, tied to her current beliefs presented in the source,
Yeah.
is since the Bible condemns this kind of activity.
Then the source of this undeniably real supernatural information must be demonic. That's her conclusion.
Yes. She makes a distinction, too, between, like, frauds or charlatans.
Who just give vague guesses, hold reading and stuff.
Right. Versus those who she believes are tapping into something real, something supernatural, which she identifies as demonic, because they give these concrete, checkable details.
And the motivation for people seeking them out, it's usually loss, right? That desire for connection.
Deep loss, the source says. A child, a partner, sometimes even pets. People just desperate to connect again.
And she mentioned how common these practitioners are.
Yeah, she commented on how widespread it seems to be from her perspective in the source.
Okay, so moving from personal accounts, the sources also bring up a historical or biblical example, right? King Saul.
Yes, that story comes up in one source as a kind of, well, cautionary tale, maybe?
What's the setup?
Saul is king, the Philistines are about to attack, and he's terrified. He tries to get guidance from God through the usual ways: dreams, priests, prophets.
But nothing.
Nothing. The source says God wasn't answering him.
So even though he had previously banned mediums and spiritists,
Exactly. He'd kick them out. But now, in desperation, he tells his guys, find me someone who can talk to the dead.
and they find a woman at Endor.
Right. Saul disguises himself, goes to her at night. She's initially scared, naturally.
Because it's illegal by his own law.
Right. But Saul promises she'll be safe. Then he asks her to bring up the spirit of the prophet Samuel.
Okay, bold move. What happens?
Well, the source describes it dramatically. The medium sees Samuel appear. She cries out, apparently recognizing Saul through his disguise.
How? Did Samuel tell her?
The text implies she saw something divine or spiritual, a spirit ascending out of the earth, and immediately connected it to Saul, asking for Samuel, realizing who he must be. Saul reassures her, asks what she sees.
And she describes Samuel.
Yeah, an old man in a robe. Saul recognizes it as Samuel and bows down.
And Samuel's message. I gather it wasn't good news.
Not at all. The force recounts Samuel basically saying, why have you disturbed me? He tells Saul straight up, God's turned against you because you didn't obey him about the Amalekites. And then the really grim prediction, God's going to hand Israel over to the Philistines. And tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me, meaning dead, joining Samuel in the realm of the dead.
And did it happen?
The source points out that, yes, the biblical account says Saul and his 3 sons died in battle the very next day. The prediction came true within that specific time frame mentioned in the source.
Wow, that's intense.
It really is. And the source notes this is one of the only times in the Bible, really, apart from maybe Jesus raising someone or Moses and Elijah appearing later,
Where someone tries to contact the dead and actually seems to get a clear, verifiable response like that.
Exactly. Which, from the perspective of these sources, highlights how rare and probably dangerous trying this sort of thing is considered to be.
Okay, so if we pull all these pieces together, the psychic anecdotes, the former practitioner saying the source is demonic, this intense King Saul story,
Yeah.
what's the final message the sources are trying to convey?
Well, they interpret Saul's story as a big lesson. His mistake wasn't just going to the medium, though that was forbidden.
What was a deeper mistake then?
According to this view, it was his failure to trust God when God went silent. When he didn't get the answer he wanted, he panicked and relied on his own understanding, turning to a source God had warned against.
Instead of just waiting or trusting.
Right. And so the advice drawn from this in the sources is pretty classic biblical wisdom. Trust in the Lord with all your heart.
Lean not on your own understanding. Yeah, I know that one.
In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will direct your path. That's the principle they highlight.
So the direct advice for you listening coming from these sources is basically don't go asking mediums for guidance.
Pretty much. Don't go to any created thing for advice, is how one source puts it.
Instead,
Go to the creator directly.
because the sources argue that's where you'll get the best and right answer.
Though they do add a caveat,
Mm-hmm.
it might not be the answer you want.
But it'll be the one you need. That's the idea presented. Okay. That was definitely a deep dive into the specific views in these sources. So just to quickly recap for you, we started with that striking story about the CIA psychic's reaction.
Then we heard from former practitioners who believe, based on their own experiences with verifiable details, that these abilities actually come from demonic sources and are spiritually dangerous.
Right. And we looked at that biblical example of King Saul, how seeking answers from a forbidden source, driven by fear and lack of trust, led to disaster, according to the narrative.
And throughout this, our aim was just to lay out the perspectives and the information presented in these particular sources to help you get a quick handle on their viewpoint.
Yeah, we really just focused on relaying what was in the material you provided, trying to be impartial about it.
So considering everything we've unpacked from these sources, the warnings about deception, the emphasis on where you seek guidance, here's something maybe to think about.
Given these accounts and the concerns they raise about discerning truth, how do you approach figuring out the real source of information and wisdom in your own life?